If you've clicked on this video, I assume you've already seen the news. Jodie Whittaker will be leaving Doctor Who at the end of the next series and a couple of specials. I'm looking forward to reflecting on her time on the show once she's done. But what interests me a lot more than 13's goodbye is 14's hello, because a new Doctor is always a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you have the increased media coverage and the new viewers that would bring. It's a great jumping on point for people who've never watched the show. But on the other hand, you've got the people who already watch the show, and their version of Doctor Who, their version of the Doctor, will suddenly disappear. And it's very possible that a lot of them will lose interest. It always happens. I think part of this is inevitable, but there is a way to limit it, and the secret is in the companions. And I'd like to dive into why. There are essentially two ways to do a Doctor's first story. There are the blank slate episodes where everything starts over, Doctor and companion introduced at the same time. Then there are the regeneration stories where elements are kept, like companions carrying over between Doctors. And personally, I reckon the latter is so much healthier for the show. Keeping a companion is the secret to a smooth and successful transition of Doctors. For starters, their presence reassures viewers that it's still the same show that they used to love. While we're adjusting to this strange new Doctor with their strange new face and mannerisms, we retain that element of familiarity with the other stuff in the episode. But it's not just that, because we're not the only ones adjusting to this strange new Doctor and their strange new face and mannerisms. The companions doing that as well. We've lost our version of Doctor Who, but so have they. It becomes a plot point. They're the audience insert, reacting and adjusting to this change at a similar pace to us. They often take us through the same stages of grief, hopefully landing on acceptance at a similar time to us, or at least showing us that it is possible to accept this new face as the Doctor. In the history of the show, this way has been a lot more common. In classic Who, a Doctor's introduction always retained a companion or two. One of the hardest jobs the show ever had was keeping the audience interested when the kind, wise, and old Doctor Who suddenly became this fella. I don't want to downplay how great a job Patrick Troughton did. Had he been any less perfect and well-defined in the role, I don't think the show would have lasted past 1967. However, I think Ben and Polly sticking around between the first and second Doctors really helped. They had a really hard job walking the line between the surprise at the change and rejection of his new form. Completely brushing it aside would have been silly, but dwelling on it for too long could have got that Doctor off to a bad start. The concept of regeneration hadn't been properly established, and wouldn't be for another decade, but I think this balance is something that they got right on the first try. When Patrick Troughton became Jon Pertwee, we got the closest thing to a complete fresh start. Jamie and Zoe had been taken away, the show was now in colour, the format completely changed. There's no denying that this was a very different Doctor Who. However, we did have one saving grace on this front. Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart was there with UNIT, the one piece of connective tissue with the 60s show, reminding us that this is the same Doctor and this is the same Doctor Who. He stuck around for the regeneration after that, as did Sarah. Adric, Nyssa and Tegan hadn't known the fourth Doctor for very long when he became Peter Davison, but they still had to adjust to the change. Perry also hadn't spent very long with the fifth Doctor when he became the sixth, and I think she came the closest to never really being on board with the change.
I am the Doctor, whether you like it or not.
They got off on the wrong foot, and although she never outright rejected this incarnation, their relationship wasn't the greatest. I wonder if this rocky transition may have had an impact on the public perception of this Doctor, which is notoriously less than ideal. It's definitely not the only factor at play, but I doubt it had zero impact at all. Then with Seven and Mel, they had a pretty standard time. I think the routine they established all the way back with Ben and Polly was really strong, and one of the reasons the classic series survived as long as it did. There were never any completely blank slates, there were always some ties to the previous version of the show, the version that people loved, and that gave people enough incentive to stick around long enough to grow to love this version of the show. People still had their favourite Doctors, their favourite eras, their favourite companions, but it was easier to look at the series as a whole and say, that's Doctor Who. Things definitely changed after that. In 1996, we had the first fully fresh start since 1963. The TV movie was a soft reboot of Doctor Who. Paul McGann's version of the character arrived with no one there to tell him who he was, which became a plot point in itself. So he went on that journey of self-discovery at the same time as the audience, who learned who he was with the new characters. Unlike the previous regenerations, there weren't any existing fans of the current era who would have been alienated by this lack of connectivity, because there wasn't a current era to connect to. So this approach definitely works for a reboot, except this reboot went nowhere and the series was not picked up. In 2005, we had the first fully fresh start since 1996. Rose was a soft reboot of Doctor Who. Christopher Eccleston's version of the character arrived with no one to tell him who he was, which later became a plot point in itself. So he went on that journey of self-discovery at the same time as the audience, who learned who he was with the new characters. Unlike the previous regenerations, there weren't any existing fans of the current era who would have been alienated by this lack of connectivity, because there wasn't a current era to connect to. So this approach definitely works for a reboot. Since then, the approach to Regeneration has always been tied to whether the showrunner stays on or not. When RTD stayed from 9 to 10, so did Rose. When we went from 10 to 11, we were back at square one. Clara carried over between Moffat's two Doctors, 11 and 12, and then Chris Chibnall gave us a completely fresh start with 13, Ryan, Graham and Yaz all introduced in the same episode. Let's talk about these New Who ones in a bit more detail. I've spoken about the Christmas Invasion before, but it had a really hard job. The hardest job of any episode since The Power of the Daleks in 1966. They had to introduce a whole new generation to the idea of regeneration. You just got the kids and adults of 2005 on board with the premise of Doctor Who, and suddenly, after just one series, you took away the lead character that they knew and loved. How could you keep them on board after that? I mean, much like in the 60s, it definitely helped that this era's first Doctor was followed by one of the best of all time. David Tennant is immediately something special once he steps out of the TARDIS at the 40-minute mark. Oh, but what was that? He only appears 40 minutes into the episode? Why is that? Well, it's because they were really clever. They knew what a shock to the system this regeneration would be, and made it into the whole story. Rose Tyler is the main character of the episode. She carries it on her back. She feels betrayed by the Doctor, abandoned by the one she originally loved, refuses to accept this new man in his place. They take it slowly and let her properly express her complicated feelings about him. Viewers at the time may have been uneasy about the change, but here was the show's other main character reassuring us that it was okay to feel that way. Getting all of that rejection and disappointment out of the way right at the start as the central conflict of the episode allows Rose to become less angry about it. She calms down a bit, and as the episode progresses, we get to the point where the characters and the world and the show really needs the Doctor. They leave us waiting for so long that his return is so much of a relief that we don't care what he looks like. And our immediate icy cold reaction to this strange man and his new teeth has had the time to melt. I can't express enough how much of a perfect story this was to transition us from one Doctor to another, but it was a special case because it was New Who's first time introducing a new incarnation. But here's the thing, every time there's a regeneration, it's someone's first time. Maybe not every episode has to be 40 minutes of adjusting to the change, but I think it really helps with getting an audience on board. Everything that Christmas Invasion did well was also done well by Deep Breath. I mean, some would even say that that story did it even better, but that would be a tad controversial, and I want us all to be on the same side here, so I'll refrain from saying it, even though it's true. Although by then we were culturally accustomed to this whole changing lead actor thing, the change from the 11th Doctor to the 12th was a big deal, and that was reflected in Clara. The regeneration isn't a shock to her. She knew about the Doctor's other faces, just as we did. But that doesn't mean she was happy to see her Doctor go.
No. Please don't change.
I love 10 and 11, but they are very similar Doctors in a lot of ways. Young and sexy. This guy was something brand new to Doctor Who. Old and sexy. People needed convincing. And who better to convince them than their favourite old Doctor, ringing them up from beyond the grave. To tell them that he's still the same man and he needs them to believe in him. There were still those who gave up on the show, but I was personally still on board. More on board than I would have been if the 12th Doctor had burst onto the scene completely alone. Speaking of Doctors bursting onto the scene completely alone, our first fresh start for New Who was for the 11th Doctor, who started his run with no companions or familiar characters to bridge the gap from old to new. The only adjusting to the new incarnation we get is on his own, because why would anyone else have anything to say? This is the case in all stories where a Doctor regenerates alone. They react and come to terms with their own appearance in brief moments that are really fun, but nowhere near as meaningful as the slow journey towards acceptance that the companions go on. The 11th Hour is a fantastic introduction to the Moffat era, and I wouldn't change it. But there is the question of the "I stopped watching when David Tennant left" crowd. They exist, quite vocally, everywhere you look. Part of that is always going to be just because of the popularity of that incarnation, and the attachment kids had to him. But I have to say that there were also a couple of things working against Eleven's success. For starters, he was sabotaged. Maybe that's a bit extreme, but also maybe it isn't. What kind of sick fuck centers a Doctor's last story on him not wanting to change, introduces a bullshit element of the man we know dying and a new man taking his place, and never resolves it? There's no moment where the Doctor goes, you know what, I will regenerate. His last words are of resistance. RTD was a great showrunner, but an awful bastard on this front. Moffat introduced a similar thread in The Doctor Falls and Twice Upon a Time, but the point in that was that there was a resolution, an acceptance that it's worth keeping on as the Doctor. Telling the audience that Tennant's replacement was just some new man set him up for failure. I've seen a few people point out that Moffat combats this really cleverly by making sure everyone in Ledworth already knew this raggedy gentleman as the Doctor. They spend the whole episode episode telling him and telling the audience who he is. This story shows that there are a few benefits to a fresh start. The new Doctor will get that defining moment where they introduce a companion to the TARDIS really early on in their era. When a companion carries over, there's no need to re-explain it to them. We didn't get Capaldi doing it until Series 10, unless you count him introducing it to Batman, Gandalf and Wildstyle in LEGO Dimensions, whereas Matt Smith had it in Episode 1. But still, 2010 is where a lot of people abandoned ship. The 10th Doctor was unbelievably popular, and I think the transition to 11 could have been smoother. It's a radical thought, but could there have been a version of events where 10 regenerated with Wilf there to watch? I don't know how much of an improvement it would have been overall, but maybe it would have been a more compelling reason for people to continue watching. They could have kept Wilf there for long enough for people to notice that Smith was really good. At the very least, there wouldn't have been such a clear-cut line in the sand between eras. Speaking of clear-cut lines in the sand between eras, the introduction to the 13th Doctor and Chris Chibnall's showrunning career was probably the most reboot of all the eras so far. New style, new music, new tone, new characters. Everything I knew from Doctor Who was gone in a moment, like
tears in rain.
And I'm gonna be honest, it didn't feel like Doctor Who to me. I know nothing feels like something until it is that something, but that doesn't mean I had any less whiplash going from Series 10 to Series 11, and Doctor 12 to Doctor 13. I would have liked someone there to remind me I was watching the same show, or something, a familiar face, or place, or institution, but I know how tricky it is when it comes to a change in showrunner. Not only will a writer come into the series full of ideas and a desire to be unburdened, but the previous showrunner will want to wrap up all of the stories they've started to tell, tying up all their loose ends. But I think there's probably a balance to be found between that closure for the old, the freedom for the new, and the need to reassure people that it's still Doctor Who. Thank you for coming to my poetry recital. With a character like Clara or Donna or Rose, there's too much going on there. There's too much storytelling baggage that you wouldn't want to shift onto another writer. But for simpler, more normal companions, I don't really see the harm in bringing them across from showrunner to showrunner. Characters like Martha, Wilf and Bill would be perfect for it. Alternatively, it would require a lot of planning, but they could also maybe river song it. Have the new showrunner write an episode in the series before they take over, introducing us to the person who will become the next companion. That way, the previous showrunner can wrap up their shit, but the person taking over has a chance to bring back an element from the previous series. So the gap is bridged, the showrunner is happy, and the audience have an insert to react to the new face. Perhaps these suggestions are all kind of nothing. I don't know. I just think maybe it would help with the show's longevity. Because looking back at the history, one method of transitioning has yielded much better results. And I think it's an often overlooked factor that goes into a compelling regeneration. People losing interest in the show when the face and direction of it changes completely is inevitable. But that doesn't mean the show can't try and make these changes a little easier to accept. I can't believe I'm going to say this. I really genuinely can't. But when the 13th Doctor regenerates, they should keep Yaz. She's the perfect, baggage-free, basic companion who couldn't be ruined by a new showrunner. Because there's nothing to ruin. I guess Dan might be a good candidate as well, but I don't know Dan yet. As much as people will tell you otherwise, fans of this era exist. Young fans of this era exist. Every regeneration is someone's first. And I think we're due another story of a companion coming to terms with a new Doctor, because it will undoubtedly help the audience do the same. Thank you for watching. It's been really fun talking about Doctor Who again. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, leave it a like and consider sharing it around a bit. The algorithm has been burying a lot of my recent uploads, so I'd really appreciate it. I'd love to get a nice conversation going on down in the comments. Let me know if I'm onto something or whether I'm just going mad. Yeah, subscribe to the channel if you're new. Check out my social media links in the description. See you in 2 weeks. Love you lots.